This presentation is about sin. Sin is an important idea in real Christianity. It involves the idea of going against God to do things that are morally wrong, and it's universal. So this presentation is all about sin. It's about what sin is, about where the temptation to commit sin comes from. And on the way, we'll take a look at what the Bible means when it uses the words devil or Satan. So let's look at a definition of sin first of all. Remember the basic idea of right and wrong in Christianity. Jesus talks about doing to others what we would like others to do to us. That's the kind of law that Christianity has. There's a more expansion of it. You shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that gives us a simple definition of sin. Sin is lawlessness. It's breaking this moral law between right and wrong. So that's one definition of sin. But you can think about it in slightly different ways. There's another picture there in the letter of James. If we know the right thing to do and we fail to do it, that's sin as well. So you can commit sin by sitting in an armchair and reading a good book if there is something else that you should have been doing. And a third definition of sin comes from Romans, and it says if you can't do it faithfully, then it's sin. So sin is faith, is an act which comes from one's knowledge of what God would have us do. The Oxford English Dictionary defines sin as an immoral act considered a transgression of divine law. That's not a bad summary of what we've just seen. And the point is that there are sins of all sorts of magnitude. You can commit sin by taking more than your fair share of the food at a meal, or it can lead to something like genocide. They're extremes in terms of what the effect is like, but both of them are sin. So sin is something that covers a wide range of magnitude of effects. The second point about sin is that sin leads to death. The first human being sinned, and death came into the world because of that, but death is there because humankind is a sinning species. We're a sinning group of people. We all commit sin, and so the world contains death. The other thing is we all commit it. It said all have sinned in Romans 5. In the letter of John, the first letter of John, it says if we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. We're telling a lie. Maybe we're telling a lie to ourselves if we think that we have never committed sin. So we commit sin just like everybody else. So where does the temptation to sin come from? Well, the Bible actually is very clear, and it's not what a lot of people think. So here we are. This is a progression from the letter of James, chapter 1. And first of all, it says you can't be tempted by God. God doesn't tempt anybody. But it says every person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. So the process starts with the desires of our mind, with what we want. And he says that desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin. So we want something, we have a desire in our mind for something, and that takes us on to commit sin. And he says then when sin, when it's fully developed, when it's grown up, brings death. So we have this picture that starts off with the more wicked desires of our mind that lead us on to sin. and end up with death. And this process going from what we like to sin is called temptation. And temptation is something that we all end up having to face. We have desires that make us want to do things. Often they're desires which can go either way. So if you're hungry, for example, then you might like food. Well, you would like food. If you simply go and cook yourself some food from the food that you possess and make yourself a meal, nothing wrong with that. If you steal some food, then that's sin. And the temptation might be, I can see that food there now, I'll eat it now. That's not a temptation that happens to most people, but people do get tempted to do things that are wrong, and it's all part of the same idea. So temptation comes from within our minds, it comes from our own desires. Another chapter, another verse, another passage, perhaps I should say, which says the same thing. Mark chapter 7, and this is Jesus talking to people who are criticizing him, and they're saying, what you do is what defiles you. And he says, well, it's what comes out of you that defiles you. And he gives a list of the things that come from within human minds. And really what he's doing is he's giving a list of all sins. Not a very comprehensive list, but nonetheless he's identifying sin. Where does it come from? It comes from within, out of the heart of man. And Jesus emphasizes that. He repeats at the end, these evil things come from within. And what he's telling us is that sin comes from the heart of mankind. Human beings, inside their inmost thoughts, have this desire to do things which often are wrong. So the source of temptation is our own minds. John, writer of the gospel, but here he is in his letter, describes the temptations of our mind. There are three bits of it. He talks about the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, so the desires of the flesh, hunger, sex, I suppose, desire of all kinds. Those are the desires of the flesh. The desires of the eyes, you see something and it looks good and you say, oh, I'd like that, I want that, and you commit sin to get it. And the pride of life, it makes you look better. Those are the three things that lead on to sin. Those are the three things from the world which in our minds can produce temptation. So it's a description of where temptation comes from. And in the Old Testament, you get something similar. He's talking about the human heart. It's deceitful above all things, and it's desperately sick. So our heart, again, in the Old Testament, that's our innermost thoughts. What it says about those is that they are going to deceive us, and if they're ill, they can bring some terrible things. So the human heart is an evil thing, or the human minds can be, perhaps one should say, a very evil thing. And it's deceitful. We can convince ourselves we're doing the right things when really we're going against what God would have us do, and we're doing things that are immoral and wrong. So temptation, again, it comes from our own mind. That's the message of the Bible. Watch your thoughts, because they're liable to lead you to do things that are wrong. What about the devil? Well, in the Bible, the devil is the thing that tempts us. Interestingly enough, it doesn't appear in the Old Testament. The devil is a New Testament idea, and it really is talking about what it is that tempts us. We've just seen that is our own minds. It's the wicked thoughts that come up in our minds. That's what tempts us. Jesus was tempted by the devil. He was tempted by the same thing that we are tempted by. The devil is what tempts us. That's a good definition of the term devil. But we've just seen we're tempted by our own evil thoughts, and so the devil must be another name for our own evil thoughts. We're not talking about some independent being which is out there, sort of supernatural being which causes inexplicable harm and does dreadful things. We're talking about something that's part of our human makeup. One of the interesting points, of course, we saw it in James a moment ago, is that sin leads to death. Sin brings death when it's grown. So that principle says you can't have an immortal sinner. You can't have something which tempts to sin, which produces sin, which lives forever. Such a thing would have to die. The principle God has is that sinners die. So if there was some kind of evil being outside humanity which tempts us to sin, that will be committing sin in doing so, and it would be an immortal sinner. The thing that the Bible says doesn't exist. Again, that's a principle that goes right from one end of the Bible to the other. What about the idea of Satan? Well, Satan is just a Hebrew word, Satan, and it's a word that could mean opponent or adversary, someone who opposes us. Anyone who opposes us could have this term applied to them. And here's an example of how the word is used. Two passages, and if you look at them carefully, you can see that they are talking about the same incident. It's talking about a time when David sets out, or he tells the commander of his army, Joab, to go out and count all the people from one end of Israel. The southernmost town was Beersheba, and Dan was the northernmost town. It says he wants to know how many people there are, and Joab is reluctant to do this, and in fact it leads to disaster in the end because Joab doesn't do it properly. But if you notice in 1 Chronicles 21 who it says Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. If you look then at the parallel passage in 2 Samuel, which is talking about the same incident, it says the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel and he incited David against them. So the Lord God is the person who incites David to produce a census of Israel. 1 Chronicles 21, then Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to number Israel. Well, if you think that Satan is a wicked supernatural being opposed to God, there is a problem there. But if you take the probable real meaning of this word Satan, well, not more than probable, the real meaning of this word Satan, it just means opponent. And what's happening here is that God is being an opponent to Israel, or he is raising up somebody as an opponent to Israel. But the point about it is that it's just an opponent. The word doesn't refer to an evil supernatural being. It refers to an opponent. And you find that that works consistently throughout the Bible. If you simply replace the word with an opponent or an enemy or an adversary, then you get the story without any need to invoke a supernatural being as part of what's going on. New Testament, slightly more sophisticated. The Greek had lots of different words for enemy or for opponent. They seem to have made a thing of having different kinds of opponent. And when they were talking about a more generalized opponent, particularly a more generalized opponent of God's people, then they needed another word. And what they did was borrow the word from Hebrew or possibly from Aramaic and use the word Satan, Satan, to fulfill the need that they had. So if you look, for example, in Matthew chapter 16, we've got an occasion. Jesus has just told Peter that he is going to go to Jerusalem, and there he's going to die. He's going to be crucified. And Peter says, You don't need to do that. It's not going to happen to you. It's tempting Jesus not to go to Jerusalem and not to be crucified on our behalf. And Jesus refers to Peter. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, it's not talking about some creature that is tempting Peter. It says very specifically that Jesus said to Peter. And if you look, it's not that the thoughts have come into Peter's mind from some supernatural being. He's thinking the things not of God, but the things of man. So it's very clearly Peter, and it's very clearly human thoughts that are getting in there. And Peter is, by this, being an adversary to Jesus. So he says to Peter, he says, "You talk about the things of man, it's Peter." And Peter, who is one of the prominent disciples of Jesus, is described here as being Jesus' adversary because he is trying to persuade him not to go and die on the cross for our sins. Another example, 1 Corinthians 5, the Apostle Paul is writing about some member of the congregation in Corinth who has done something particularly unpleasant, and he says, "You've got to send this man to Satan, some adversary, to stop these desires of the flesh from carrying on." Why? So that his spirit might be saved in the day of the Lord, on the day of judgment when Jesus returns. This man might be saved because he's been turned away from his wicked course. Well, if Satan means a supernatural enemy of God, it's just the wrong place to send him, isn't it? But if it just means an opponent, particularly an opponent of this member of the congregation, someone who's going to restrain him and stop him from doing things that are wrong, then you've got a totally different picture. And this is the word Satan. It just means an opponent in the New Testament, more specifically kind of opponent, but nonetheless an opponent. And this man has been delivered over to some adversary to stop him from doing wicked things. Or another example, in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20, talks about two characters called Hymenaeus and Alexander. And what's happened to them? Well, they've been handed over to an opponent, to Satan, so they may learn not to blaspheme. Again, if Satan means the supernatural enemy of God who encourages wickedness and sin, then just the wrong place to send someone to learn not to blaspheme. If it means an opponent, no difficulties. Hymenaeus and Alexander are sent to this opponent to learn not to blaspheme against God. So how do these words Satan and the devil refer to one another? I mean, how do they relate? Well, the point is that Satan refers to an adversary, and our wicked tendencies, they are our own enemies. So sometimes we are Satan's to ourselves, and that's what the devil is. The devil is, whenever it appears, it's always an adversary to us. So the devil can always be referred to as Satan, but it's not the only thing that can be referred to as Satan. So an example, for example, where the devil referred to as Satan is Matthew chapter 4. And in that passage, you get several occasions where the words devil and Satan are used interchangeably. But you get other places. We saw in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1 where God was referred to as an adversary of Israel, and he incited Israel to, or David, should I say, to count Israel. That's 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1. So God can be referred to by this same word. And we also get verses where angels are referred to as adversary. There's one in Numbers 22:22 where an angel is sent to prevent the prophet Balaam from doing the wrong thing. And well, look at yourself. It just appears as an adversary in the English text, but the Hebrew word underlying it is this word Satan. So the word Satan can refer to any opponent of us, and that includes the devil, the evil thoughts in our mind, the part of our nature that leads us to go towards sin. This is a practical outcome. There's something it means to us. The point is that the devil, the human heart, the bit of us that leads to wickedness, it says, is deceitful and desperately sick. And that means that we have to watch out what our desires tell us to do. We can tempt ourselves and we can be tempted to do things that are wrong, and we need to think about that. We don't want to do the wrong things, or we shouldn't want to do the wrong things. Unfortunately, we're wrong there. We often do want to do the wrong things, but we shouldn't do them, and that means we need to check what we're doing. We can't trust our own desires. That's the important point about this. So let's summarize what we've seen. First of all, we saw what sin is. It's a failure to act in a moral way, and we saw that sin leads on to death. And then we saw that the temptation for sin comes from inside our own minds. We are the people who tempt ourselves in the end. And finally, that leads us on to something very important, which is before we do something, before we act on our impulses, we need to think very carefully. Are those impulses right, or are they wrong? We've got to remember that we're liable to make excuses for ourselves and to try to convince ourselves we're doing the right thing when actually we're doing nothing of the kind. But that is the important thing about sin. Sin is deceitful. Sin is something that we get led into over and over again by simply not following the moral line and by the temptations that come from our own minds.